I still remember the way he said it, like it was nothing at all, like I was an afterthought. He looked at me and said they could only afford one spot on the trip, so she was going. That was it. No hesitation, no apology, not even a second glance to see how those words landed. I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because something inside me went very still. While they packed sunscreen and sandals, I quietly started packing my life. They had no idea that by the time they returned, everything they took for granted would be gone, including me. Thank you for watching. It means a lot to me. Please tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading those messages. My name is Pearl, and I live in a quiet corner of Mississippi. Life here moves slow, the kind of slow that lets you hear your own thoughts. For years, I thought that peace came from being needed, from staying useful in someone else's story. I worked, I helped, I gave more than I ever kept. But the truth is, sometimes the people you give everything to forget what you've done. They start seeing your kindness as something that will never run out. I didn't realize I'd been running on empty until that day he said those words about the trip. That was the moment I stopped feeling sorry and started seeing things clearly. I grew up learning that love meant showing up even when no one asked you to. I raised him through the storms, held this family together when everything else fell apart. And when there was nothing left in my hands, I still gave. I was the one who sold my small house to help with the down payment on the one they're living in now. The one who stayed up at night when bills stacked too high. The one who stepped in when they didn't know where to turn. I did it because that's what a mother does, not because I expected anything in return. I thought my place in their lives was steady like a tree that never moves no matter the wind. But over time, the warmth started fading little by little, like a light dimming so slowly you don't notice until the room is dark. The small moments changed first, a forgotten thank you, a quiet glance that said I was just part of the background, someone to rely on, but never to see. I brushed it off because love makes excuses. It tells you they're just busy. It convinces you that being silent is enough. I told myself that families have seasons, that this was just one of them, but somewhere deep inside me, something began to ache. A quiet ache that never quite left. I remember the night they signed the papers for this house, how proud I felt handing over the money I had worked for all my life. It wasn't just bricks to me, it was security. It was a promise of belonging. I thought it would be a place where laughter would stay, where I would grow old surrounded by love. But years have a way of showing truth you don't want to see. The house started to feel less like home and more like borrowed space, like I was just a piece of furniture tucked in the corner. I cooked, I cleaned, I helped raise their children, but my name was never really spoken. My efforts were treated like air. They didn't even notice the way I had learned to make myself small, to not disturb, to accept the silence they left me in. I used to think that kind of silence was normal. Now I know it was the sound of being forgotten. When he said he could only afford one ticket, it wasn't just about the trip. It was a mirror held up to everything I had ignored for years. It was the quiet proof that my place in their world had already been decided long before that day. And standing there, smiling so I wouldn't break, I finally felt it fully. I wasn't part of their plans anymore. I was just there to fill in the empty spaces. That was the moment my heart began to close the door they left open too long. I still remember the way the sun poured through the living room that morning, soft and warm, as if nothing in the world could go wrong. I had just folded a pile of their laundry, a habit I'd fallen into without even realizing it. The house smelled like coffee and clean linen, everything quiet, everything steady, until he walked in with that casual shrug and said the words that stripped the air right out of me. We can only afford one spot, so Madison's going. Just like that, with no hesitation, no pause to think about how I might feel. He didn't look at me as a mother who had stood beside him through every storm. He looked at me like someone who simply didn't matter in this part of his life anymore. I held the folded towel in my hands and smiled, not because I was fine, but because that was the only thing left to do. Madison walked past with her suitcase, humming, excited for her trip. She didn't even glance at me, not once. She didn't ask if I was okay with staying behind, if I needed anything, if I wanted to talk. She just kept packing, her laughter floating through the hallway like a reminder that they had a world I was no longer part of. I told myself not to make a scene. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded like everything was all right. My hands were shaking a little, but no one noticed. No one ever noticed. I watched as they zipped their bags, printed their boarding passes, and planned their week of rest, while mine would be spent alone in the house I helped them build. It felt like I was watching my own life from the outside, standing in a home full of memories, but suddenly feeling like a stranger. Later that day, I walked into the kitchen where I had spent years cooking for them, years setting plates on that table I bought with my own savings. I traced my fingers across the edge of the counter, remembering how proud I was the day it was installed. That kitchen had seen birthdays, holidays, long nights, and endless meals I made for them when money was tight. I thought those things meant something. But standing there alone, I realized the memories were mine, not theirs. For them, it was just a place to pass through. A place they didn't even think about when they chose who would go on that trip. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, the same one I bought when I moved in, the same one I offered to sell when they needed help with the down payment. I stared at the walls that once felt safe, now so quiet I could hear every heartbeat in my chest. It wasn't about a ticket. It was about what that ticket represented. I had been slowly fading from their lives for a long time, but this was the moment they said it out loud without ever needing to use the words. It was the moment they made it clear I was no longer part of their plans. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it sink in, not as a sudden wound, but as something I'd been carrying for years without naming. I realized I'd been living in a house that I paid for, but didn't belong to anymore. I had become a shadow that moved through the rooms, silent, useful, but never seen. That truth hurt more than I can ever explain, but it was also the beginning of something new. Because once you finally see where you stand, you stop trying to hold on to what's already let you go. And that night, when the house grew quiet, I made a decision that would change everything. That night, I sat alone in the living room, with the lamp casting a soft yellow glow over the walls, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to push the pain aside. I let it sit with me like an uninvited guest, heavy but honest. The sound of the clock on the wall felt louder than usual, like it was reminding me of every hour I had given to this house, every quiet night I spent making sure they had a home they could lean on. I looked around at the furniture, at the curtains I picked out, at the rug I paid for in full, at every single thing in that room that I had built piece by piece. And I realized how much of myself I had poured into a life where I wasn't even being seen anymore. I thought about the years I spent working extra shifts, the nights when I skipped meals to pay for something they needed, the holidays I gave up so they could have theirs. I thought about the small ways I made their lives easier without ever being asked, the love I gave quietly, never demanding a thank you. For a long time, I believed that kind of love would always hold a place. But sitting there, I finally understood that not everyone values what they don't have to fight for. I had made it too easy for them to forget. I had given them everything without asking for space of my own. I walked slowly through the hallway and into the guest room, the one that had become mine over the years. It wasn't much, but I had made it warm with my little touches, soft blankets, a small shelf of old books, a framed photo of him as a boy. I stood there for a long time, staring at that photo, remembering the child who once ran into my arms and whispered secrets like I was the safest place in the world. Somewhere along the way, the boy I loved grew into a man who forgot what I meant to him. That thought didn't make me angry. It broke something quiet inside me, something I had been holding together for too long. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of years pressed down on my chest. The truth wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It whispered. It said I had been left behind long before this vacation was planned. That ticket was only a confirmation of what had already happened. And as I sat there, staring at the empty room, a calm settled over me. Not the kind of calm that comes from acceptance, but the kind that comes when a decision starts forming inside you. Quiet but unshakable. I thought about the way they laughed earlier in the hallway, the way they walked past me, as if my presence didn't matter. The way I was expected to stay behind and keep everything in order while they disappeared into their joy. I had spent too many years being the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who holds everything together. But this time, I wasn't going to keep waiting to be seen. I was done being a shadow in a house that only remembered me when it was convenient. And in that moment, as the clock kept ticking, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't be here when they came back. Not as a silent figure in the corner, not as the one who kept things running. This time, I would be gone, and they would feel the weight of my absence the way I had felt the weight of their neglect. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, sat on the edge of my bed, and let the stillness of the house wrap around me like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat, steady but full of everything you've held in for years. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the early light spill over the yard. For years I had started my mornings this way, waiting for a house full of noise, waiting to be needed. But that morning felt different. It wasn't waiting anymore, it was deciding. I reached for the phone and called the one person who had always seen me without me having to explain myself. Her name was Lillian. She'd been my neighbor for years, the kind of woman who understood what silence meant without needing words. When she picked up, she didn't ask why I was calling so early. She just said, "I've been waiting for this day." Her voice was steady, warm, like someone who had seen a storm coming long before I did. I told her I was leaving, and instead of shock, she said, "Good, it's time." That call was short, but it was everything I needed to hear. I wasn't alone, not this time. Someone saw me. Someone understood the weight I was finally putting down. Lillian told me she knew of a small place by the coast, a place I'd always talked about but never allowed myself to imagine as mine. She said she would help me, that we could make this happen quietly before they returned. For the first time in a long while, I felt the ground shift beneath me, not from pain, but from the power of choosing myself. I hung up the phone, stood in that kitchen filled with everything I had built, and whispered to the walls, "I'm leaving. This time, for good." I spent the next few days moving through that house like a quiet breeze, touching everything I had once given without a second thought, seeing it now for what it truly was, pieces of a life I had built with my own hands. I opened closets, drawers, and cabinets, and each thing I held carried a memory that felt heavier than its weight. The dining table I bought the year they were struggling to make ends meet. The couch I paid for so they'd have something soft to sit on. The curtains I picked out because she said she liked light colors. The dishes I bought one by one when money was tight. It was all mine. Every last bit of it. And they never even noticed. I started making quiet lists, labeling boxes carefully, not out of anger, but out of a calm that surprised even me. I wrapped the china I inherited from my grandmother, folded linens I bought with my own savings, set aside my old record player that had kept me company long before this house ever did. I didn't rush. I moved slowly, almost gently, as if I were tucking away the last pieces of a life that no longer belonged here. I packed during the hours when no one would call. No one would need me, and the house sat in that strange stillness that had become so familiar. Every box I closed felt like a quiet goodbye. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just breathed. The ache that once lived in my chest began to turn into something sharper, something stronger, like the edge of a new beginning. I arranged for movers through a small company Lillian knew, people who could come and work without questions. She promised she'd be there the morning they arrived, and that thought made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt in years. As the days passed, the house started to change. It wasn't obvious at first, but the warmth began to leave with each thing I packed. The rooms echoed a little more, the walls looked a little barer, and I realized I wasn't just taking things with me. I was taking the life I gave to this place. I was reclaiming it. And with every quiet step, every box carefully sealed, the pain that had felt endless began to loosen its grip. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something that finally felt like mine. The morning I chose to leave came quietly, like it didn't want to disturb what was already decided. I woke up before the sun, slipped my feet into my worn slippers, and walked through the house one last time. The movers were coming soon. But I needed this moment alone with the walls that had held both my laughter and my silence. I stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the empty spaces where my furniture had once stood. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a place I had carried on my back for too long. I walked into the kitchen and ran my fingers along the edge of the counter I had paid for, remembering all the meals I had cooked there. Not one of those meals was ever about me. Every plate, every dish, every late-night tea was for someone else. I whispered a soft goodbye, not because I was sad, but because I wanted to leave without bitterness. Then I went to my room, folded my last blanket, and zipped up my suitcase. It was lighter than I expected, not because I left things behind, but because I was finally taking only what was mine. When the truck arrived, everything moved in quiet rhythm. No shouting, no noise, just the sound of boxes being carried out and doors opening and closing. Lillian stood by me, steady and calm, and her presence felt like a promise that I wasn't walking into emptiness. I was walking towards something that belonged to me. I handed over the keys to the lawyer like I had planned, and with that small motion, I let go of years of carrying more than my share. Before I stepped out, I looked around one last time. The walls echoed without the weight of my things, and the house felt as empty as the space they had left in me long ago. I didn't leave a long letter. Just a single folded note sitting on the mantel. It read, "She who is not invited is no longer responsible." That was all I needed to say. No explanations, no begging to be remembered. I closed the door behind me and didn't look back. The air outside felt different, lighter, almost like it had been waiting for me to step into it. For years I had given everything I had to that house, to those people, to a place that forgot me. But as I stood there in the early morning light, I finally felt like someone who belonged to herself again. When I arrived at the little coastal town Lillian had told me about, it felt like stepping into a breath I had been holding for far too long. The air was cool, fresh, carrying the soft scent of salt water that seemed to settle deep into my chest and calm something that had been restless inside me for years. The house was small, nothing like the one I had just left behind, but it was mine in a way that place never truly was. The walls didn't hold anyone's expectations. The floors didn't carry years of unpaid gratitude. This was a space that belonged to me, and for the first time in so long, I could feel my own presence filling it. I walked through the room slowly, letting my fingers trail along the smooth white walls, listening to the gentle sound of the ocean in the distance. I could hear the gulls crying somewhere far away, the waves rolling like a steady heartbeat, and the wind pressing softly against the windows. Everything was simple here. No photos of a life I was left out of. No heavy weight of being taken for granted. No space I needed to shrink myself to fit into. This was mine, every inch of it, and the silence didn't hurt anymore. It felt like peace. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky slowly turn pink as the sun began to rise. I hadn't seen a sunrise like that in years because I had always been busy keeping things together for everyone else. But this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to call my name or ask for help or hand me a list of things to do. I was just sitting there, breathing, letting the morning belong to me. I wrapped the blanket a little tighter around my shoulders and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt free. There was no guilt in me that day. No voice whispering that I had to explain myself. No need to justify the choice I made. For years, I had been the one holding the family together. The one who gave everything without asking for a single thing back. But sitting there in that small chair facing the ocean, I realized something clear as the horizon in front of me. I didn't owe anyone my silence anymore. I didn't owe anyone my presence. I didn't owe anyone the pieces of me they never appreciated. I closed my eyes, listened to the waves, and smiled to myself. They had left for their vacation thinking I would still be standing in that same spot when they came back. But for the first time in my life, I had chosen me. And that choice felt quiet, steady, and unshakable, like the sea itself. While they were gone, I could almost picture the sound of their laughter echoing through that empty house, as if their absence had left behind a ghost that mocked how easily they had walked away. I imagined them at the airport, smiling for photos, holding hands and talking about everything they were going to do on that vacation. I could see her leaning against him, the way she always did when she wanted to look perfect for the camera, and I could hear his voice, careless and easy, like nothing and no one was waiting back home. They had no idea that what they left behind wasn't going to be there when they returned. They thought I would still be sitting in that kitchen, still folding laundry, still making everything neat and ready for them. But this time, they were wrong. The day they returned, the house no longer belonged to the life they had built on my shoulders. The movers had done their part well. Everything I had packed, every piece that held my touch was gone. The walls were bare, the living room hollow, the kitchen stripped of its warmth. The house had turned into a shell, a reminder that what they took for granted was never theirs to begin with. I could imagine their faces as they opened the front door, expecting comfort and finding silence. I could hear that stunned pause, the way silence swallows a room when shock sets in. I pictured her voice first, high and sharp, calling his name as if he could fix it, as if something had been taken from her. Then his footsteps moving fast through the house, doors opening, drawers being pulled out, cabinets slammed shut. Their voices would grow louder, questions spilling over each other, panic laced in every word. Where's the couch? Where's the table? Where's everything? They would look around and realize just how much of that house had my hands in it. They had built their lives on things they never paid for, on spaces I had filled without being asked, on love they never once truly acknowledged. I didn't need to be there to see their faces. I knew exactly what they looked like. Shock always has the same shape. First it's disbelief, then panic, and then that strange kind of anger that comes when people realize they've lost something they thought they owned. But the truth was simple. It was never theirs. It was mine. And I had just taken it back. I sat quietly by the window of my new home, listening to the ocean, knowing at that very moment they were standing in an echoing house that finally mirrored the way they had treated me for years. Empty, forgotten, silent. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't me who carried the weight of that silence. It was them. The calls started coming in before the sun had even set. One after another, my phone lit up with their names, their voices climbing through the speaker, filled with panic, anger, and confusion. The first call came from him, and I let it ring. Then another. Then another. It didn't take long before the messages followed, each one louder, sharper, more desperate than the last. Where are you? What did you do? How could you? I read the first few, then placed the phone on the table beside my chair and turned my head back toward the sea. The waves rolled in and out like they always did, soft and steady, as if reminding me that the world wasn't falling apart just because they finally felt what I had been feeling for years. I thought about the countless times my phone had been silent when I needed them, the birthdays they forgot, the holidays they spent elsewhere while I sat alone, the way their voices only came through when they needed something. Back then, silence felt like being invisible, but now their noise didn't reach me the same way. It bounced off the walls of this little house, like distant echoes that no longer belonged to me. Their anger didn't scare me, their confusion didn't shake me. I had already made peace with my choice. I walked to the window and watched the ocean as the sun dipped lower. My heart didn't race like it used to when his name appeared on the screen. It stayed calm, quiet, steady. For years, I had answered every call, rushed to fix every problem, stretched myself to hold together something they never valued. But this time I didn't answer. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I simply let them sit in the emptiness they had created long before I ever packed a single box. Eventually, the messages softened, panic turning into pleading. Come back. We can talk. We didn't mean it like that. But the thing about apologies that come too late is that they don't carry the weight they should. When you spend years showing someone they are background noise, you don't get to act surprised when they finally leave the room. I closed my eyes and let the breeze from the open window wash over me. I had spent too much of my life trying to be enough for people who didn't notice I was already giving them everything. I reached for the phone, held it in my hand for a moment, then placed it face down. I didn't need to block them. I didn't need to erase them, because the silence I gave them now was louder than anything I could ever say. They had their vacation. I had my peace. And for the first time, it wasn't me chasing after a place at their table. It was them standing in the echo I left behind. As the night grew darker, their calls slowed down, but the messages kept coming. The words shifted from anger to guilt, from shouting to pleading, from blaming to begging me to talk. They were standing in the ruins of everything they took for granted, trying to understand how it all slipped away. But the truth was, nothing slipped away. I simply took back what was mine. For years, I carried their comfort on my back without them ever stopping to see it. I made that house a home, not for me, but for them, and when they stopped seeing me, they stopped seeing everything that came from my hands. Now they were staring at the walls I left behind, bare and hollow, just like the way they made me feel. I thought about every single thing they used without once asking how it got there. The furniture, the dishes, the appliances, the rug under their feet, the roof over their heads. It wasn't luck that gave them those things. It was me. My sacrifices, my savings, my long nights. All the small decisions I made to make their lives easier while mine got smaller and quieter. They forgot, and maybe they never even realized. But forgetting doesn't erase the truth. It just means one day, when the person holding everything finally lets go, everything collapses. As I sat in my small chair by the window, listening to the sound of the ocean, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel regret. I felt the calm that comes from finally standing where I should have stood years ago. I had spent so long holding my love in ways they never noticed, and now I was holding it for myself. They had built their comfort on my generosity, but they never built respect around it. And without respect, love becomes a quiet weight that drags you down. I had carried that weight long enough. Somewhere between the sound of the waves and the wind brushing against the window, I realized something simple. I didn't need them to understand. I didn't need them to see what they had done. I didn't need their apologies or their tears. All I needed was to keep walking forward, to keep breathing in the air of a life that finally belonged to me. Their shock and their screams didn't belong to me anymore. They could fill that empty house with all the noise they wanted. I wasn't going back. I had already left, not just from the walls they stood in, but from the silence they kept me in for too long. I looked out at the dark sky that night, the waves rolling softly against the shore, and for the first time in many years, the quiet around me wasn't heavy. It was peaceful, steady, like a promise I finally made to myself and kept. I had spent so much of my life giving without asking for anything in return, hoping that love alone would be enough to hold a place in their hearts. But love without respect becomes a quiet burden, and I had carried that burden long enough. I didn't leave to punish them. I left to save myself, to remember who I was before I let my worth get buried under their comfort. I knew their lives would never look the same again, not because I took things away, but because they would finally see just how much I gave. Maybe they'd learn something from the emptiness. Maybe they wouldn't. But that was no longer mine to carry. My world is here now, in this quiet home by the water, where my peace doesn't depend on being seen, where I don't have to beg for a place in someone else's plans. This is the life I should have chosen sooner, but I'm grateful I found it now. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If this touched something in your heart, tell me where you're watching from. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. I'll be here, sharing more of my truth, piece by piece, with all of you.